All right, so today I'm going to tell you a little bit about chicken bog or perlo, which is a dish that goes way back in South Carolina history, across the low country. It's a good combination of a lot of ethnic groups and their foodways. So it's very popular dish for large groups or small groups. It's a good way to feed a large number of people because you can cook it all in one pot, hence a one pot meal. And here we go, we're going to get into making this dish now. As a one-pot dish, we always start with the meat. In this case, we've used chicken. Chicken is very common today, but you can also use other forms of wild game, such as ducks, doves, squirrels, and pork. William Bartell, in his travels through South Carolina in the 1700s, mentions making a squirrel perlo. So there's some historical background there. You always cook your meat until it falls off the bone. That's how you start. A lot of times the broth is seasoned with easily sourced spices such as salt, black pepper, garlic, and some homegrown crushed red peppers. These are things that would be easily found across America throughout the colonial period to today. Very important that you season your broth well, because all of the flavor of the dish is going to rely on your broth and anything else you add as far as the meats. Now, moving on to our other ingredients that are going to be going into this perlo. I'm going to start here with some pork. This is some home-cured pork. It's salt-cured. And the reason it's a staple in a lot of these southern dishes is because it was very cheap to grow. You just free-range your hogs. It was easy to cure in our environment using a salt-curing method. And because you could salt-cure it, it was ready year-round and available because you did not need refrigeration. So it acts as a good seasoning because it's been salt-cured and allows you to introduce salt in your dish without actually salting it. So I'm going to go ahead and move into, I've already had some of this sliced. I'm going to go ahead and start to kind of dice it up. We want it to be in smaller pieces so the fat renders out evenly as we are cooking it down as the base of our dish. Just going to kind of get it into some smaller pieces, break it down so, like I said, cooks out a little bit easier. And just like that, we've got about all the bacon we're going to throw in there. Now, another common ingredient, today at least, and you don't see it in too many historical recipes just because sausage wasn't terribly available, almost all of the chicken bogs and perlos you will find in Georgetown and Horry County, and some throughout the PD region, are going to have a sausage. Normally a fine ground smoked sausage, like for instance we have some smoked kielbasa here. And next up, another very prominent ingredient was an onion, because it was very cheap to grow again and ready year-round. They grow all the time. In this case, we have just a white onion. So I'm going to go ahead and start to kind of cut this down in smaller pieces. I'm going to cut my ends off here. Sort of dice it up. Again, to make it cook a little bit easier, a little bit quicker, and so you don't have large, coarse pieces of onions throughout your dish. And an onion, you see it in a lot of southern dishes, all the way down to Louisiana and the French areas, is in bases like mirepoix. It just allows you to get a nice caramelized, kind of sweeter flavor to your dish. And again, I'm going to cut it up into smaller pieces here. And this will be put straight in with our cure meat and our sausage. so they all cook out before we will kind of deglaze the pan with our broth that has already been seasoned and cooked from the chicken that we picked earlier. And our next ingredient, which is kind of what the Perlo is famous for, is the use of rice. So being from Georgetown County, had a lot of rice growing happening. And we were one of the richest colonies at one point because of our rice. So it's very important that we incorporate rice into this dish, and it was very readily available to almost anyone, at least in South Carolina. So that's kind of why, part of the historical basis of the dish and why it's such a food staple across the South. All right, so we're going to start out here by adding this salt cured pork, this bacon, into a preheated cast iron pan. And as we start to render this out, we'll get it pretty cooked before we start to add our onions in, and then we will follow up by adding our sausage once our onions are pretty much cooked and caramelized, because the sausage is already cooked and we don't want it to get overcooked. Now, back to the rice. So, in some of the other places across the South, you may have been more accustomed to potatoes or corn, but with our coastal environment and great conditions for growing rice, we had a lot of influence on the economy based around rice. So everybody around was eating Carolina Gold rice, and it just became kind of like a symbol of South Carolina pride, I would say. You ate rice at every meal. And of course, it has also influenced other places. You have rice in like red rice and jambalayas and things like that. So I'm going to go ahead and add the onions in. And we'll get that stirred all in there. Keep that bacon from burning to the bottom and sticking. And turn the heat down so it's not cooking quite so fast. As you can see there, the fat on that cured meat is starting to turn translucent. It means you've rendered a lot of the grease out of it. So some time has passed now, and here you can see our onions are starting to turn translucent. It's about time to add the sausage. Now, I'd also like to talk about the fact that Perlo and dishes like Hoppin' John, which is a meat, rice, and pea-based dish, are kind of fusions of different cultures. You see elements of culture from English, French, and African dishes, all kind of culminating into these special South Carolina-specific dishes like chicken bog and Perlo. All right, so a little more time has passed here. We've let the sausage kind of warm up in there. We're going to go ahead and add our chicken and let it warm up and soak a little bit of that bacon grease and onion kind of juice. A little bit of pork in there too. And as we let that kind of simmer down in there, we will move on to measuring out our broth. All right, so at this point, we got everything kind of warmed up and cooked together. We're going to go ahead and add this broth and deglaze it. Now, broth has been pre-measured. We got about 2 cups of broth here. It's important to measure your broth because the word Perlo can be interpreted by the French as a barely cooked rice, or rice cooked until it is fluffy. And that's one of the differences between a perlo and a chicken bog, because a bog is cooked until it is kind of mushy and sticky rice, and in this case we want our rice to be very fluffy. Go ahead and stir this around a little bit, make sure all that goodness cooked out of the onions down there is soaked up into our broth. And at this point I'm gonna go ahead and we're gonna cook this like any other pot of rice, and I'm just gonna add my rice, and then we'll go ahead and turn it in so it gets down in the broth and gets steaming and cooking out. And then I'm gonna go ahead and add my lid and let it finish cooking out in there. All right, so you see here's our finished product. We got a nice brown color to the rice, and you see that the rice doesn't really look like it's sticking together on everything. It's kind of its own fluffy element of the dish. And you might notice I have some pickles there, and that's almost always a perlo is served with bread and butter pickles or any kind of other sweet pickles. It can also be served with commonly slaw, white bread, cornbread, things like that. And it's really a great example of how the culture of South Carolina has created a nice one-pot dish for large groups of people.